She was born a princess, but she died in silence. No palace, no crown, just a hospital bed and a window that never opened. For 38 years, she vanished from royal portraits, erased from family dinners, spoken of in whispers, if at all. Princess Alice of the United Kingdom was the mother of a future queen. But while the world adored Elizabeth, her mother was locked behind hospital walls, forgotten like a ghost with royal blood. This is not just the story of mental illness. It's the story of how power rewrites love, how duty buries the ones who break, and how a woman born to rule was left to vanish in plain sight. She was born into a world of gentle voices and polished floors. Alice of Battenberg, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, opened her eyes in Windsor Castle in 1885. A palace wrapped in tradition, whispers, and the low hum of distant bagpipes. To the world, she was just another royal child. To those who saw her up close, she was radiant. They said her gaze was too deep for her age, like she understood things she hadn't lived yet. Even as a toddler, Alice would sit quietly under the giant windows, tracing shadows across the floor with her fingers, as if reading invisible words written in light. Her family saw potential. She had the high cheekbones of her mother, the direct stare of her father, and the solemn silence of old royalty. But what no one saw, what no one could prepare for, was how early the cracks would form. She didn't speak for years. Doctors feared she was deaf. She would nod and smile, but never answer. Her world was quiet, not cold, but muffled, like hearing through water. Some thought she was slow, others thought she was odd. But one doctor looked closer and discovered the truth. Alice wasn't lost. She just heard the world differently. Her ears worked, her mind was sharp. She simply didn't process sound the same way others did. She had taught herself to read lips, not from a book, not from a teacher, but by watching her mother's face move, syllables forming like ripples on a lake. From that moment on, she was no longer the quiet child. She was the clever one, the girl who listened with her eyes. Her tutors were stunned. She spoke 5 languages by the time she was a teenager. She read history like a priest reads scripture, searching for meaning, not just facts. And yet, even in brilliance, she remained soft. She fed birds on the balcony. She braided the hair of her younger sisters. She once sat beside a servant girl crying and said, "You don't have to bow when no one's looking." Alice was royalty. But she wasn't born to command. She was born to feel. At court events, she'd disappear into corners, not out of rudeness, but out of breath. She said later that crowds felt like storms, noisy, pulling, too many voices trying to enter at once. She found comfort in order, making lists, folding napkins, lining her shoes perfectly under her bed. It was her way of making the world still. She once wrote in her diary, "I feel as though I am always standing on a glass floor, smiling while the cracks run underneath." But no one asked what that meant. Not back then. Royal children weren't supposed to feel fragile. They were supposed to stand straight and marry well. And so, when she turned 16, the conversation shifted. From books to ballrooms, from tutors to titles. Her smile changed. Not bitter, not sad, just thinner, like a candle burning on both ends. In the spring of 1903, she was presented at court, jewels around her neck, gloves to her elbows, every movement choreographed like a ballet of status. But behind the diamonds, She was still the girl who fed birds, still the child who had taught herself to hear. Everyone said she had found her match when she met Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. He was tall, charming, strong, a soldier, a future king. They married quickly. It looked like love. And perhaps, in the beginning, it was. But even fairy tales, when written by real bloodlines, carry more ink than light. In 1903, Princess Alice married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. The ceremony was grand, a gathering of empires. British, Russian, Danish, German, nations stitched together by lace, silk, and political convenience. But Alice didn't see a map. She saw a man. And in those early days, she loved him with a quiet certainty. Andrew wasn't a poet. He was a soldier. But he smiled at her when she forgot to bow. And once, when she dropped a glove in the middle of a ball, he retrieved it without making a scene. For a girl raised on ceremony, small kindness felt like thunder. They moved to Greece, a kingdom sun-drenched and unstable. The monarchy there trembled beneath civil unrest, revolution, and the bitter tug of war between old nobility and new democracy. It was not a place for soft hearts or delicate minds. But Alice tried. She adjusted. She studied Greek, embraced Orthodox rituals, and walked barefoot into villages to distribute food with her own hands. No attendants, no photographers, just a woman in a white dress, handing bread to children who called her Angelissa, little angel. She gave birth to 5 children, 4 daughters, 1 son. The youngest girl, Sophia, would one day become the Queen of Spain. The only boy, Philip, would be raised by other hands across other seas. But that part comes later. At first, Alice seemed to blossom. She laughed more. She joined charities. She even began corresponding with spiritualists and monks, feeling drawn to something deeper than thrones. But the world around her was shifting like sand underwater. In 1917, the Greek monarchy collapsed. Andrew was exiled. The family fled to Switzerland. Their bags were light, their hearts heavier than gold. Alice's brother-in-law was executed. Her cousin, the Tsar of Russia, murdered with his children in a basement. Blood ran through royal veins like ink from torn paper. And still, she held together, at least on the outside. But inside, the cracks were spreading. She began hearing voices. At first, it was only whispers in prayer, then visions, then full conversations. She told her family she had been chosen by God, that she had a divine mission, that angels were speaking to her through the walls. Andrew panicked. Her children were moved to other rooms. A doctor was summoned, then another, then a priest. In 1930, without her consent, Alice was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. She was forcibly institutionalized in a clinic in Switzerland. Her husband didn't visit. Her children were told to forget. She was not allowed to write letters. Her jewelry was taken. Her Bible was censored. She would spend months in silence, not by choice, but by order. The girl who had once taught herself to hear was now told her thoughts didn't count. There are photos from this time. Alice on a bench. Alice in a wool coat too large for her frame. Alice staring past the photographer as if the camera itself was part of the noise in her head. She said little. But when she did speak, it was in fragments. Poetic, jarring, sometimes terrifying. "I have seen the shape of God," she once whispered. "He is faceless and full of flame." The doctors called it delusion. but they also noted something strange. Her pulse was calm, her temperature steady. She never resisted, never cried, never screamed, as if she had accepted this new world as a form of exile. And yet, amid the darkness, there were glimmers. She asked for paper. She drew shapes, circles, veils, spirals. She requested flowers in her room, specifically lilies, which she called the bells of forgiveness. She listened to the wind and said it was carrying messages. One nurse recalled that Alice often stood by the window during storms and said, "The lightning reminds me that even silence has a voice." The clinic kept her locked away. For her safety, they said, but no one asked. From what? From herself? From the world? From a family that couldn't bear to hear her speak her truth? Back in Britain, her name faded from papers. Princess Alice became a footnote in family trees. Her husband moved to the French Riviera. Her son, Philip, was passed from relative to relative like an heirloom no one wanted to keep. The girl who once spoke 5 languages now spoke to no one. Her silence was not golden. It was cement, poured, hardened, sealed. And yet, somehow, she kept breathing. Silence, for most people, is a break. A pause between words. A breath before speaking. But for Alice, silence became a second skin. It wrapped around her like fog. Soft, invisible, impossible to shake. At the Swiss clinic, the doctors called her stable. She was not violent. She did not scream. She folded her clothes each morning. She whispered prayers no one understood. She followed rules like a dancer counting steps. But inside, her mind was cracking like old porcelain. Her memories began to blur. Not vanish, but smear, like ink left out in the rain. She forgot which month it was. Sometimes she forgot her age, but she never forgot the names of her children. She would whisper them over and over, as if reciting a spell to keep them real. Philip, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, Sophie. But they were gone, taken, removed from her orbit like stars flicked from the sky. No letters arrived, no birthdays celebrated, no drawings sent in childish scribble. To the royal court, Alice had disappeared. To her children, she was a rumor, a soft, uncomfortable memory, a cautionary tale whispered in gold-lined hallways. Your mother is unwell. And so her world shrank. Not all at once, even once, but day by day. First, her books were taken, then her mirrors, then her right to decide when she walked or whom she saw. She became a name on a clipboard, a diagnosis in a drawer, an inconvenience to a crown. There were days she didn't speak at all. But her silence wasn't empty. It was full of questions that had no place to land. Why did no one come back? What did I do wrong? Was love a privilege I lost? Nurses came and went, treating her like glass or stone, something beautiful but broken. Some whispered in German, thinking she couldn't understand. She understood every word. Die verrückte Prinzessin. The crazy princess. A title not chosen, but assigned. She once told a nurse, "I'm not mad. I'm just listening to a world you can't hear." But in a place built to drown out voices, the quietest soul is always the most dangerous. What they didn't know, what no one could imagine. was that her silence was not surrender. It was survival. She began meditating. She fasted. She kept her room immaculate, as if preparing for a guest who never arrived. She wrote in scraps, notes hidden beneath her mattress. Fragments of dreams, visions, symbols, circles inside circles, eyes with no pupils, a throne made of stone and wind. Her inner world became her cathedral, and in that solitude, she became a pilgrim without footsteps. Then, one night, she collapsed. Her body, already thin, already pale, simply stopped responding. No fever, no wound, just exhaustion that no one could treat. They called it nervous fatigue. Others called it catatonia. But one nurse, braver than the rest, simply said, "She's grieving something we never let her bury." They moved her to a quieter wing. No visitors allowed. No clocks on the wall. Just soft lights and white linens. A place where days bled into nights and back again. Time in those halls wasn't measured in minutes. It was measured in absences. One morning she asked for a violin. Not to play, just to hold. She said the wood remembered sound. Another day, she tore pages from a medical journal and folded them into tiny birds. She placed them on her windowsill, letting the wind carry away paper truths. These were not symptoms. These were messages. But no one was listening. Far away, in palaces untouched by grief, her children were growing up. Philip was enrolled in school. He never spoke of her. Not because he didn't care, but because no one let him. A mother behind locked doors is not a mother the crown wants in its portraits. Still, Alice dreamed. She dreamed of Cecilia's laugh, of Margarita's small hands, of Philip riding a pony in circles, yelling her name. She woke up weeping, soft, quiet, the way only forgotten people weep. And then she would sit, all day, facing the window, waiting for nothing. But not entirely. She was waiting for permission to exist again. No such permission came. Not from doctors, not from family, not from God. And so she rewrote herself. She stopped being Alice the princess. She became Alice the listener, Alice the watcher, Alice who waited, not because she had to, but because she still believed that silence had an end. You can silence a woman. You can lock her away, remove her voice, erase her name. But the body remembers. By the mid-1930s, Alice's silence was no longer spiritual. It became physical. Her skin paled to porcelain. Her hands trembled when she tried to pour tea. She fainted in the garden once. Eyes open, lips moving, but no sound came out. The doctors said anemia. The nurses said stress, but no one called it what it was, a slow dying of self. Her spine began to ache from sitting so long. Her feet swelled from lack of movement. She stopped eating meals and instead requested only fruit, apples, pears, occasionally grapes. Not for taste, for memory. She once told a nurse that grapes reminded her of the Greek hills. "They taste like sun in exile," she said. Her hair began to fall out in strands. She collected it in a silver box and kept it on the table beside her bed, as if mourning her own fading in real time. And yet, no one sent for her children. No one brought her home. She had become a relic in a forgotten wing. Breathing, yes, but not really living. A ghost made of soft bones and stitched silence. Her breathing grew shallow. Nurses noted that she sometimes gasped in her sleep, as if fighting off dreams she couldn't outrun. One night she bit through her own lip in the middle of a nightmare. Blood stained her pillow. She never spoke of it the next day. When asked if she was in pain, she simply replied, "Only when I remember my name." The pain was not dramatic. It didn't scream. It lingered, like a draft under a door, always present, always unwelcome. She had stomach cramps, dizzy spells, rapid heartbeat. But medical tests showed little. Her suffering was not clinical. It was invisible. The kind of ache that only shows up in eyes and breath. One doctor called it female hysteria. Another called it melancholic fatigue. But no diagnosis could explain why her heart skipped whenever she heard a boy's voice in the hallway that reminded her of Philip. And then came the fall. It happened in winter. Snow outside, a slipper on tile. She slipped, hit her shoulder, and cried out, not in pain, but in shock that anyone heard her voice. It had been so long, too long. She was rushed to a quiet ward. X-rays, bandages, bed rest. The injury was minor. The response was not. Her body, already brittle from years of isolation, began to deteriorate faster. She stopped walking. Her muscles thinned. Even the bones in her face seemed sharper, as if the flesh itself was giving up. She began losing control of her hands. She would reach for a glass and knock it over, try to write and end up drawing lines. The woman who had once folded napkins into perfect roses now watched her fingers move like they belonged to someone else. She told a nurse, "My body is tired of being a prison. It's trying to let me out." By 1937, she weighed less than 90 pounds. Her clothes hung like shadows, her skin bruised from the slightest touch. She would sit at her window for hours, wrapped in a wool shawl, unmoving. When asked what she was doing, she said, "Trying to become lighter, so the world stops pressing down." Sometimes she still smiled, not wide, not often, but in a way that felt like a candle fighting wind. She smiled at pigeons, at sunlight caught in the dust, at the sound of distant bells from a village church she could never visit. She smiled when nurses hummed songs. She once said, "A melody is a place the body can hide when it hurts too much to stay here." Then, one morning, she didn't rise. Her nurse found her still in bed, eyes open, unmoving. Not dead, but somewhere between this world and the next. They tried to wake her. No response. Tried to feed her. She turned away. A psychiatrist was called. He examined her and declared, "Princess Alice has entered a state of voluntary withdrawal." Voluntary. As if she had signed a document. As if giving up was a decision one makes with pen and ink. But those who knew pain understood that sometimes the body gives up before the heart does. She remained like that for days, still, eyes tracking the ceiling, breath shallow, lips dry. And then one morning she whispered, "I dreamed I was a tree with no leaves, but my roots still touched water." They marked it as a delusion, but it was prophecy, because something in her began to shift, not toward death, but toward rebirth. Not yet, but soon. If her body had broken quietly, her mind began to fracture loudly. Not with screams, but with visions and whispers that came when no one else was speaking. The doctors called it delusion. She called it revelation. The year was 1938. Europe was trembling toward war. But in her hospital room, the battlefield was inside her head. She began to speak more, not to people, but to things. To her sheets, to the wind, to birds on the windowsill, to saints only she could see. She once whispered to a blank wall for nearly an hour, and when asked what she was doing, she replied, "He's lonely. No one has spoken to him in years." She heard voices. Some were soft, some were cruel. Some gave her instructions to stand, to pray, to fast, until the body felt as light as forgiveness. She believed she had a divine calling, that she was chosen to heal the sick, to become a bridge between heaven and suffering. She requested a Bible, then burned the edges of the pages, because fire reveals the truth better than ink. She fasted for 3 days straight, then offered her meals to an imaginary monk she claimed lived under the floorboards. To outsiders, she was slipping. But in her own eyes, she was awakening. She believed the hospital was not a prison, but a monastery. The nurses were novices, the doctors, high priests of modern doubt. She began renaming them: Mother Silence, Brother Salt, Keeper of the Night. She no longer called herself Princess. She called herself Alice the Penitent. Sometimes the vessel, sometimes just wind. She spoke of past lives, that she had once been a shepherd in the desert, that she had kissed the feet of saints, that she remembered the sound of nails in wood and wept for reasons no one else understood. One morning, she stood in the hallway, barefoot, and declared, "Today, I bury my name." They found her 2 hours later in the chapel, weeping silently in front of a candle she had bitten into, wax clinging to her lips like frozen tears. The nurses began to fear her, not because she was dangerous, but because she saw things they couldn't explain. She told one nurse, "There is a boy crying in the walls. Please help him." Another time, she asked a nun to remove her shadow from the room because it was too loud. She slept with a rosary wrapped around her ankle and claimed it anchored her spirit to the earth. She once spent 4 hours rearranging furniture in her room so that Maitsari, the angels, could land safely. Her family was informed, but no one came. The world outside was unraveling. Hitler had annexed Austria. The monarchy was dissolving. War was becoming inevitable. Alice, trapped in her visions, barely noticed. She would speak of storm clouds, but not the ones in the newspapers. The ones she saw above her own bed. The ones that whispered in ancient tongues. They tried new medications, new schedules, new therapies. She was sometimes calm, other times distant, and sometimes frightening in her stillness. Eyes wide, mouth slightly open, as if listening to a symphony that no one else could hear. A nurse wrote in her log, "She looked holy and haunted." One day she asked to be baptized again, not because she didn't believe, but because she wanted to start over with cleaner hands. She washed her own clothes in the sink, whispering prayers with every drop. She took off her wedding ring and placed it in a box she made from old hymn sheets, writing on the lid, "I release myself from expectation." But the paranoia grew. She believed the hospital was bugged, that people were watching her through the light fixtures, that her thoughts were being read and rewritten. She covered her mirrors. She stopped eating food she didn't prepare herself. She once accused a doctor of stealing her dreams. And yet, she never became cruel, never lashed out, never broke the fragile trust she had with the kindest nurses. Instead, she folded into herself like paper, creasing over time until her soul became small enough to fit inside a prayer. And still, even in that maze of fear and fire, there were moments of clarity, moments when she remembered who she had been. She once asked a nurse, "How is my son? Does he still run like he used to?" Another time, when told the Queen of England had visited Athens, she smiled faintly and said, "Good. That city needs grace." In those rare flashes, she was not mad. She was Alice. The girl who spoke 5 languages, the woman who handed bread to the poor, the mother who remembered every birthday, even if she wasn't allowed to send a single card. But those flashes never lasted. The shadows always returned. The voices grew louder, and her mind, like a castle besieged by silence, began to crumble brick by brick. By 1939, war had come. Bombs fell, borders broke. Monarchs were exiled or executed. But in the quiet wing of a hospital in Switzerland, Princess Alice was still breathing. Barely. But still. They had expected her to die years ago. When her mind began to crack, when her body stopped eating, when her voice faded into whispers and symbols. But she didn't. She lingered, like smoke that refuses to lift, like the last leaf on a winter branch, trembling but stubborn. She no longer responded to her name, unless spoken gently, by a nurse who had known her before. Sometimes she looked up at the sound of birdsong. Other times her eyes followed patterns in the wallpaper for hours. She wasn't gone. She was simply beneath everything, buried under layers of memory and prayer. And still, her heart kept beating. Her body had become thin, translucent, like old paper that had been folded too many times. Veins visible, skin pale as candle wax, hands cold, feet always wrapped in wool. They kept her bed near the window. She watched the seasons turn as if they were passing through someone else's life. In spring, she smiled at the bees. In summer, she asked for peaches. In autumn, she stared at the falling leaves and whispered, "They know how to let go." And in winter, she simply waited. She had stopped writing, stopped speaking in tongues, stopped seeing saints in the corners, not because she no longer believed, but because she was tired of explaining belief to people who only measured pulse and pressure. She folded into silence the way others fold into sleep. A surrender not of defeat, but of exhaustion. And still, she lived. The nurses began to change. The ones who feared her left. The ones who remained treated her not as a patient, but as a relic. A woman who had once been royal. Then mad. Now, something else. Some called her the ghost. Others said she had become a kind of living icon, a silent figure of suffering, lit from within by something no one could name. Visitors came, not family, but curious theologians, psychologists, even a German mystic who bowed at her feet and said, "You are the gate between silence and divinity." Alice didn't respond, but later that night, she whispered to her nurse, "I am only a shadow with a name." Time lost its shape. Days bled into each other. Years passed, unannounced. New nurses arrived, unaware that the woman in bed had once shaken hands with queens, spoken with emperors, given birth to the man who would marry the future Queen of England. She was history, sleeping in real time, forgotten by the world she once walked in. Then, a letter arrived. From London, a simple envelope. Royal seal, Philip, her son. Now a man, now engaged to Princess Elizabeth. They wanted her blessing. They wanted her presence. She hadn't heard his voice in over a decade. Hadn't touched his face since he was a boy. Hadn't seen him run or laugh or kneel. But now, they needed her again. The nurses read the letter aloud, slowly, carefully. Alice didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply nodded and said, "Tell him I never stopped praying for his feet." They didn't understand, but Philip would have. She had once told him as a child, "I don't worry about your crown. I only pray your feet always find good ground." In that moment, something shifted. Her eyes lit, not bright, but awake. She began asking questions about the wedding, about the world, about the color of Elizabeth's hair. She asked for a mirror. She combed her hair. She requested lavender water for her wrists. The nurses stood stunned. The relic was moving. The ghost was humming. She asked to sit outside, wrapped in shawls, blankets on her knees. She watched the clouds, the trees, the way the wind played with her fingers. She said, "I feel like the world has remembered I'm still here." It wasn't healing, not quite. But it was something else, a stirring. But just as quickly, it faded. By the time Philip's wedding day arrived, Alice was too frail to travel, too fragile for ceremony, too forgotten for photographs. She sent a blessing, a necklace, a note that read, "Walk gently. Even royalty leaves footprints." Philip never spoke publicly of his mother. Not in speeches, not in memoirs. But those who knew him said his silences were shaped like her. Alice remained in the hospital, longer than anyone expected, longer than mercy would allow. 38 years. She survived empires falling, nations burning, her family breaking apart and reforming. And all the while, she was behind a window, breathing, fading, refusing to die. She never sat on a throne. She never wore the crown. But her blood sits in Buckingham Palace. While Princess Alice lay in silence, her son, Prince Philip, stood beside the future Queen of England. A man shaped by exile, discipline, and the ache of absence. He rarely spoke of her. Not from shame, but because the wounds were too clean to bleed in public. Behind every photograph of Philip in his naval uniform was a mother who hadn't held him in decades. Behind every formal royal dinner was a woman who once whispered blessings in forgotten wings of a hospital. But history moves forward, even when hearts do not. Philip married Elizabeth. They had children. And Alice, from afar, watched the lineage she carried become the lineage of a kingdom. She was the grandmother of Charles, the man who would one day be king, the great-grandmother of William, future heir. And yet, for years, her name remained a footnote, royal, but removed, present in blood, but absent in portrait. And then, the world changed again. World War II ended. The smoke cleared, and in the ruins, something stirred in Alice. It began with a whisper. She asked for a newspaper, then a radio, then a map of Greece. She circled cities with shaking fingers. Athens, Thessaloniki, Corinth. And then she said it, clearly, urgently. "I want to go home." The doctors hesitated. The nurses protested, but her resolve was unshakable. After 38 years, Alice walked out of the hospital. Not carried, not wheeled. She walked, wrapped in gray. Frail, yes, but upright. Eyes forward, hands steady. Like a woman returning to something unfinished. She moved back to Athens. Not to a palace, but to a monastery. She shaved her head, dressed in simple robes, and founded an order, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. Her mission? To serve the poor, to live without title, to care for the dying. The princess had become a nun. In the 1940s, Greece was starving. Children died in alleyways. Mothers wept over empty cradles. And Alice, the woman once dismissed as mad, now walked those streets handing out food, medicine, and prayer. She took no salary, refused royal protection, lived in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a mattress on the floor. She spoke of God often, of forgiveness, of the power of silence to transform pain into purpose. When the Nazis occupied Greece, she hid Jewish families in her home. When Gestapo agents questioned her, she looked them in the eye and said, "You may search my house, but you will not search my soul." They left, and the families lived. Decades later, she would be honored as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, a Jewish title for those who risked everything to protect life. She wrote no memoir, held no interviews. She simply served. The woman they called mad became a mother to the suffering, a stranger in her own land who never stopped giving. She wore no jewels, but her presence sparkled in hospital wards, refugee shelters, and quiet chapels. Back in England, her family was stunned. The woman they had institutionalized, the mother they had erased, was now a saint in the slums. Philip reconnected with her, carefully, quietly. Letters passed, visits arranged. He brought her to Buckingham Palace for a time. But she found no comfort in red carpets. She asked to sleep on the floor, said the walls were too thick with ceremony. She returned to Athens, to her monastery, to her calling. The world took notice, but she did not care. Queen Elizabeth offered her comfort. Alice asked for silence. She didn't want the past explained. She wanted the present served. And so, in the final years of her life, she became something very rare in royal history. A woman who gave away power instead of chasing it. She said once, "I lost everything I thought made me valuable. My title, my beauty, my family. And in that space, God found room to work." There were no cameras when she fed the dying. No speeches when she buried the forgotten. Only one voice, still and steady, saying, "You are seen. You are not alone." And perhaps that was her crown. Not gold, but grace. Not power, but presence. Not history recorded in libraries, but in the whispered gratitude of the poor and the quiet strength of a son who never forgot the woman who taught him how to listen, even when the world would not speak. Was she mad? Or simply too awake for the world she lived in? History does not judge gently. It remembers victories. It crowns conquerors. And it buries the broken beneath footnotes and footstools. For decades, Princess Alice was one of the buried. To the public, she was the forgotten mother of Prince Philip. To the palace, she was a quiet embarrassment. To the psychiatrists, a textbook case. To the press, a woman in robes and shadows. But slowly, the world began to ask the question it had long avoided. What if they were wrong? What if the silence wasn't insanity, but insight? What if the woman they locked away had simply been hearing truths before the rest of us were ready? Historians revisited her records. Medical notes written in ink too eager to label. Diaries filled with spiritual visions once dismissed as delusion. Letters, some torn, some censored, written with clarity and care. They didn't tell the story of a madwoman. They told the story of a mind that refused to collapse, even when the world demanded it. Alice's faith, once mocked, was now seen as resilience. Her fasting, her visions, her acts of service, no longer symptoms, but choices. Painful ones, but human ones. The debate began. Was she schizophrenic, as her doctors claimed? Or was she a victim of a system that pathologized grief, dismissed women's voices, and feared what it could not measure? Was her silence truly illness, or the sound a soul makes when the world stops listening? Feminist scholars saw in her the image of every woman called hysterical for refusing to be convenient. Religious thinkers saw in her the echoes of mystics, women who lived on the edges of spiritual language, unreadable to men with stethoscopes and power. Even psychologists began to revise their conclusions. One noted decades later, if she had lived today, she might have been treated with therapy, not confinement, with compassion, not control. There was no final consensus, no neat closure, just layers. Because Alice was not one thing. She was many. She was a princess, yes, but also a patient, a prophet, a mother, a stranger, a sister to the suffering. A question mark that royalty tried to turn into a period. Her family, once silent, began to speak. Prince Philip later said, "My mother was a person of deep faith. Her mind was difficult to understand, but her heart was clear." Queen Elizabeth hosted events honoring her acts of bravery during the war. Jewish organizations publicly recognized her for saving lives. Even the British press, once dismissive, now called her the most extraordinary royal you've never heard of. And so, the narrative shifted. From madness to meaning. From silence to sanctity. But not without discomfort. Because to honor her fully, history had to confront itself. The way it treats mental illness, the way it fears what it cannot control, the way women, especially royal women, are silenced when they no longer fit the frame. In death, Alice became larger than she ever was in life. She became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of transcendence, not just of what royalty loses, but of what it hides. Students studied her life. Professors assigned essays about her spiritual resistance. Documentaries were made, books published. And yet, amid the growing reverence, one truth remained sharp. No one had apologized. No doctor, no institution, no crown. She had suffered in silence. And in many ways, she still does. Because history does not always correct itself. Sometimes it simply rewrites the tone, turns tragedy into nobility, turns erasure into mystery. But for those who look closely, her story is not about royalty at all. It is about what happens when a human being feels too deeply in a world that punishes depth. She once wrote in a torn piece of paper, found years later behind a cabinet in the hospital, "I see too much. I feel too much. But I am told I am too much. So I have become less. And in becoming less, I have not disappeared. I have become flame." That line now hangs in a museum, printed, framed, admired. But when she wrote it, no one read it. And that is the paradox of legacy. It honors too late. It speaks only when the voice it silenced can no longer respond. Alice did not ask to be a symbol. She did not want pity. She wanted peace, not a crown, not applause, just a place to rest without fear of being forgotten or rewritten. Princess Alice died on December 5th, 1969, in Buckingham Palace. Yes, she died in a palace, but not her palace, not her home. It was the home of her son, and she was only a guest in the final chapter of her life. No bells tolled, no crowds gathered. Her death was quiet, soft. She had returned to England in her last months, frail and nearly blind, her voice reduced to a whisper. She wore the same gray habit she had worn for years. No crown, no title, only a cross around her neck and calluses on her hands. At her bedside was a small leather pouch. Inside it, a single photo of her children when they were young, a wooden rosary, and a folded piece of paper that read, "I am not afraid. I have already died once." She requested no grand funeral. She wanted no marble coffin, no horse-drawn parade. She wanted her body to be donated to science or buried wherever they will let me lie. Her wish was ignored. Instead, she was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beneath stone, surrounded by the dead kings and queens of a world that had never known where to place her while she lived. But even there, her stone was plain, no inscription, just her name, no title, no tribute, as if, even in death, the world wasn't sure who she had been. Years later, her remains were moved to Jerusalem, to a crypt beneath the Church of Mary Magdalene on the Mount of Olives, the city she had spoken of so often, the city she called closer to God than breath. There at last, she was placed among olive trees and stone icons, beneath mosaics of saints and sunlight. No velvet, no court, only earth and silence that didn't cage her. Visitors still come. Some know her name, most do not. They light candles, they kneel, they read the small plaque that now bears her full identity. Princess Alice of Battenberg, sisterhood of Martha and Mary, righteous among the nations. A woman who never ruled, but who sheltered the hunted, who walked barefoot in royal halls, who prayed not for power, but for peace. There are no great portraits of her in national galleries, no films made in her name. But here is what remains: a black and white photograph. Her eyes closed in prayer, head bowed, robe loose around her shoulders. It sits in a small museum in Tel Aviv, surrounded by names of others who rescued Jewish families during the Holocaust. No frame of gold, no velvet curtain, just glass and silence. There is also her handwriting, small, neat, letters to Philip, notes to her nuns, marginalia in her Bible. In one margin, she wrote, "God speaks in echoes. We must be still enough to hear them." That page is now displayed in a theological archive. Students read it. Some copy it into notebooks. Most move on. But that sentence stays, because it feels like her. A worn walking stick is all that remains of her personal possessions. It leans against a wall in a Greek orphanage she once visited. The director keeps it there as a reminder. Sometimes the saints walk slowly, but they always arrive. No plaque, no velvet rope, just the faint outline of a life that mattered in the shadows. Philip never forgot her. Not really. He brought flowers to her crypt once, alone, with no photographers, no press. He stood for nearly half an hour in silence, then whispered something no one could hear, then left. Later, when asked about that day, he simply said, "She taught me that the strongest people are the ones no one sees." And yet, there is something haunting about her legacy. Because even now, with honors and reassessments and plaques, Alice remains unfinished. Her story doesn't fit into clean categories. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't a saint in the conventional sense. She was a woman who lived between identities, between diagnoses, between countries, between rooms with doors that locked from the outside. And that's harder for history to sculpt into marble. But maybe that's the point. Maybe her final image is not a statue, not a crown, not a stained glass window. Maybe it's something smaller, truer, like the sound of her voice in a hospital corridor, asking a nurse if the birds had eaten that morning. Maybe it's the way she once folded a napkin into the shape of a swan and left it on a child's pillow. Or the way she carried her rosary not in her hand, but in her shoe, close to the ground, where she believed God actually listened. We remember kings in stone. We remember queens in gold. But sometimes we remember truth in the smallest, softest imprint. Not a monument, but a whisper. We tell stories of kings and queens because their lives seem larger than ours, magnified by gold, by power, by the echo of history. But sometimes, it's the quietest lives that leave the loudest truths. Princess Alice was not a ruler. She did not command armies. She did not sign treaties. She was not crowned, celebrated, or paraded. She was institutionalized, misunderstood, forgotten by the world she was born to serve. And yet, she fed the hungry. She sheltered the hunted. She forgave the unforgivable. She listened when no one else did. She was a royal who walked barefoot through war-torn streets. A woman with no throne who touched more lives with silence than others did with speeches. She did not rebel. She did not escape. She endured. That may be the rarest form of courage. They called her mad. But maybe she just felt too much, saw too deeply, loved too hard in a world where love is rationed and grief is taboo. They said she withdrew, but maybe she simply waited for a world kind enough to hear what she had to say. And that raises a question that still stings. What happens to the people we silence because they make us uncomfortable? The mother too intense, the sister too spiritual, the child too sensitive, the woman who asks for nothing but a little quiet and a place to feel safe. How many Alices have we locked away? In institutions, in shame, in stories we refuse to finish. There's no monument grand enough for someone like her, because her monument wasn't built with stone. It was built in acts of mercy, in prayers whispered for strangers, in food passed into shaking hands. It was built in the soul of a child she never got to raise, but who carried her gentleness into the halls of power. I've told you the story of a princess, but this isn't really about royalty. This is about what it means to be human, to live through heartbreak, to be mislabeled, to go unheard, and to keep loving anyway. Princess Alice reminds us that a crown doesn't protect you from pain, and that silence is not the absence of meaning, but often where the deepest truths begin. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't powerful, but she was present in a way few people ever are. And maybe that's all any of us really want. To be seen, to be remembered, not as mad, not as saintly, but as someone who tried and wasn't too much to love.